So if you saw my last video, you will have seen that I made the massive upgrade from a GTX 970 to an RTX 2080 Ti. But in that video, I didn't really go into my thoughts on the RTX part in its name. So that's just what I'm going to be doing in this video. So currently, RTX is made up of two new features, Ray Tracing and DLSS, and there's a list of upcoming games that will support one or both of these features. So let's start with Ray Tracing. Ray Tracing is a way of rendering light that is much closer to how light works in real life. This should not only allow for more realistic gaming visuals, but also make it easier for game developers to light an in-game environment compared to how they're currently doing it with the existing techniques. But what do I think of Ray Tracing? Well, to decide, I jumped on Battlefield 5, which features Microsoft's DirectX Raytracing, or DXR for short, which has been added to DirectX 12. So immediately, I was faced with the problem of trying to configure the graphical settings in a way that I would be willing to play Battlefield 5 in. As given that I just paid for the game and I can't afford to buy many games, I really wanted to play it in settings that I liked. But in order to make this video, I couldn't just leave DXR off and play it without ray tracing. I should say that I game on a 4K display, so there was not a chance that I was prepared to play Battlefield 5 in 1080p. With DXR off, I'm able to get a fee-synced 60fps 4K Ultra settings experience. But with DXR set to Ultra, a prerequisite for this video, I see the frame rate drop to below 30. And this is just at the very start of the game, a location that doesn't really feature any highly reflective surfaces. So I was expecting the game to get much more demanding and the frame rate to decrease once I got on further into the single player War Stories campaign. So I then tried playing with the resolution scaling, and what I discovered is that with my TV and my viewing distance and with my eyes, so this is all very subjective, the difference with the resolution scaling set to 80, whilst noticeable, is actually one that I'm willing to live with for the purposes of increasing my frame rate and being able to analyse ray tracing. I tried a range of settings between 50 and 130, just to test how much of a difference rendering at lower and higher resolutions than native 4K made. Setting the resolution scale to 50, for example, just makes everything go full potato. 80 really is the cutoff for me here, and with these settings I was able to get 40 to 60 FPS, which, isn't at all ideal, but having just come from a GTX 970, I'm very familiar with having to sacrifice frame rate for visuals, so I played on. After both of the first two War Stories, I was happy to report that apart from the occasional hitch, the frame rate stayed on the high side of that 40 to 60 FPS range. However, I was yet to experience anything that stood out to me as ray tracing. I'm sure if I made side-by-side comparisons that I could spot the differences in the lighting and shadows, but just playing the game like a gamer would and not as someone who's trying to analyse visual effects, nothing stuck out to me as looking better than standard lighting techniques. I just hadn't come across a single highly reflective surface where the difference would be more noticeable. But again, I played on. Starting the third War Story, I was greeted with a scene that I've seen used many times by tech YouTubers to demonstrate ray tracing, and I can see why. This was the first time that I can honestly say that I noticed an improvement over traditional techniques. The reflections in the puddles on the floor are brought to life with DXR, and it does add something to the overall visuals that just elevates how realistic the entire environment is. Flicking back and forth between DXR Ultra and DXR Off, you really start to notice the limitations of screen space reflections. It really amazes me just how much is essentially faked. With that said, there is still limitations to how far ray tracing has gone. Sometimes the angle or perspective didn't seem quite right to me, with me being able to see the reflections of fire, for example, that I shouldn't have been able to see. So after going back and forth for a while with the settings, I decided to just run through the area as if I was actually just playing and not trying to analyse the reflections. And I have to say that I don't think ray tracing does dramatically improve your gaming experience here. Overall, I'm left feeling like, it's pretty, so, I'd prefer to have it on than off, but it's not a game changer. With that said, my frame rate stayed above 40 here, despite the more noticeable ray traced elements. So I think I would personally sacrifice the frame rate here and leave DXR on. Starting the fourth and final War Story, I was pleased to see a level filled with windows and puddles. It's here I think that ray tracing is most successful, because adding in these reflective details everywhere does actually add to the immersion and bring the scenery to life. However, it's not all positive, because whilst at first I felt like there were explosions everywhere, The illusion really started to fall apart after a few minutes of playing the level, as I started to get distracted by how the tank, and sometimes the windows, would regularly glow red with the supposed reflection of an explosion. Something didn't feel right about this, and it would happen even when there was nothing in the appropriate direction to have exploded. So to test this, I found a reasonably closed off area, and sure enough, an area of the tank would glow red at regular intervals, sometimes even from the direction of a solid wall. I checked all sides and even above me and couldn't find any source for this lighting. It felt like it was on a loop, so I timed it and found that this happens every 10 seconds without fail. I can honestly say that I would have noticed this even if I wasn't looking for ray traced effects. In a level where you're anticipating fire from enemy tanks, it really is very distracting to see fake explosive effects that have no source. It seems to me that DICE have added this as an artistic decision to either improve the feeling of being in the middle of a war zone, or as a way of kind of like overstating the difference ray tracing makes, if that makes sense. So this to me stuck out as proof that even with ray tracing, it's still up to the developers and artists to make smart decisions, or you're going to have a bad experience regardless of the technology. It looks like it doesn't just work after all. Playing this level with DXR off though, I was surprised by how lifeless things felt in comparison. Areas like the tank that were once visually reacting to the in-game lighting now looked flat and more isolated from the environment. I also couldn't help notice more of the limitations of screen space reflections, with buildings seemingly disappearing in my peripheral vision, leaving only the significantly brighter sky, which was really quite distracting. But anyway, moving on to DLSS. So DLSS stands for Deep Learning Supersampling, and explaining what exactly it does and how it does it is not something I'm going to be covering in this video, mostly because honestly I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around it myself. But essentially it's a way of constructing a higher resolution image from a lower resolution source. It also replaces existing forms of anti-aliasing. Now, Digital Foundry have made an excellent video on DLSS, far better than my ramblings in this video, so I highly recommend checking that out. But in their analysis of their Final Fantasy XV benchmark, they found that DLSS created a 4K image using a 2560 by 1440 source. So to check this out myself, I compared Final Fantasy XV running at 1440p with TAA, native 4K with TAA, and 4K with DLSS. And these are my personal subjective thoughts. Firstly, 1440p is immediately noticeable as a low-res gaming experience, even from quite a distance away from the screen. I wouldn't personally play Final Fantasy XV like this if I had the choice. 4K and TAA look exactly how I expect from a resolution standpoint. The game doesn't exactly use the highest quality textures, but isolating just the clarity you get from the high resolution picture, and I have no complaints, except the frame rate, so all is to be expected. Now 4K with DLSS is where things get interesting. This absolutely does not look anything like 1440p. In fact, there's aspects where the image actually looks better than native 4K. Like, take the rocks in the background for example. Like, DLSS actually manages to make native 4K look like the lower resolution out of the two. I wondered if this might be down to the TAA implementation, but even with no AA, DLSS is still the best looking option. I haven't heard the best things about the Final Fantasy benchmark, so I don't put too much weight on my findings here. But given that my frame rate increased significantly, and that I noticed visual improvements with it on, or at the very least no visual downgrades, things are definitely looking very promising for DLSS. And overall, I think that this technology offers a lot more tangible benefits to gamers in comparison to ray tracing. So I think back to Battlefield 5, which will be getting DLSS soon, and in theory I should be able to use DLSS instead of setting the resolution scale to 80, and hopefully get a solid 60 FPS experience, which would be amazing. My only concern now is how will the tensor cores deal with having to power both DXR and DLSS at the same time? I am also hoping that DLSS won't always be limited to a 1440p source and a UHD 4K target, because I think that there are use cases for outside of that. For example, like a 1080p source could be used to create a very high refresh rate 1440p experience. So it's conclusion time. I do think it's very easy to get distracted by the fancy new technology and lose perspective on the overall gamer proposition here. So let's kind of try and break things down. Okay, so imagine that instead of having an RTX 2080 Ti, you had a GTX 2080 Ti instead, with exactly the same performance in non-RTX supporting games. Also imagine that it launched at the same price as the GTX 1080 Ti did, like it should have. So here in the UK that's around £700. Finally, imagine that the RTX part of the card was being offered as a separate add-in. Now I know this wouldn't work from a technical standpoint, but just, go with me on this one. But imagine that these two cards together worked exactly the same as an RTX 2080 Ti does now. The question is, how much would you pay for that add-in card? You've already justified and spent £700 on the GTX 2080 Ti part, but how much would you actually spend on the RTX add-on? If your answer is £400, then congratulations, you're one of the few people that thinks the RTX 2080 Ti is priced fairly. To me, having actually used it, I would spend an absolute maximum of £200 on it. And that's only at the 2080 Ti level. Obviously I wouldn't pay £200 to add it to a 2060. So I feel that the RTX 2080 Ti is at least £200 overpriced. Priced at £900, the card is a lot more justifiable to me. It's still too much money, but at the very least it wouldn't make me feel like I've been ripped off if I bought one. So overall, is RTX overpriced? I believe so, yes. But putting price to one side, what is my overall thoughts on RTX and DLSS? Honestly, I think that ray tracing is the future, that much is obvious to me, but I think it will have the same life cycle as PhysX has. Not that it will disappear like many people think it has, but that it will drop its tech demo feel and become very widely used. PhysX is the default physics engine for both Unity and Unreal Engine, which means that it's used in a ton of games. You just don't hear about it because it's no longer a big deal. PhysX also started its life needing dedicated hardware, so there's a lot of similarities here. And I just think ray tracing is here to stay. The RTX branding though, I'm really not sure about, just because I can't imagine PC gamers buying GPUs in 20 years time based on a widely used in-game lighting technology. I think that DLSS and similar technologies are also here to stay. It's just too promising of a technology not to succeed. I think AMD are in a stronger position here though, as consoles are already using things like checkerboard rendering to upscale games, and DLSS looks a lot more effective than that, at least on paper. So if AMD can do a good job of an open source competitor to DLSS and get into the next gen consoles, then that has a much better chance of becoming the go-to technology. I think this is why Nvidia has seemingly rushed RTX technology to launch. The consoles give AMD a lot of power in this area, so I think that Nvidia needed the head start. I'm still really looking forward to trying ray tracing in Metro Exodus and DLSS being added to Battlefield 5 and Anthem. So please let me know if you'd like to see follow-up videos on my thoughts as I mess about with those. But yeah, so if you like this video, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already and you want to see more of my videos, or perhaps consider becoming a patron. And thank you for watching.